Hey guys, Victoria here, and this is my research presentation of the paper I wrote this semester. So, to dive right in, I did my paper this semester on postmodernism and post-Christianity and the effects that has on missions and evangelism, and just different things that the church should be prepared for as we kind of enter into this culture. I think some areas of the U.S. are already there. I think some are not. I definitely found evidence to prove both, and that was written throughout the paper. I first wanted to start by just kind of talking through why I chose this topic and what originally interested me in this. And the major thing here is personally, the environment which I'm in is quickly becoming a post-Christian, postmodern culture. And I didn't really notice that until I kind of stepped out of the church bubble that I was in and really began to engage with the lost around me. And by that, I mean, when I was in college and even after graduation, I was really involved with two groups of people. I was involved with the church and I was involved with international students. And so I knew that we had lost people, and I wasn't ignorant to that, but I was ignorant to the people within my culture and my context that were lost to the Lord. And I do believe that is because of a postmodern influence that we're beginning to see. The area that I live in Mississippi, I live in a very liberal city, a blue county in a red state, and so you definitely see very liberal influences throughout the city, throughout the university, throughout the school districts, throughout workplaces. And so just to give a statistic, over 50% of my city is unchurched and unreached with the gospel. The difference here, though, is a large majority of that number aren't people that had never heard the gospel. It is a group of people that have heard the gospel and have chosen not to follow the gospel. And for a long time, I asked the question, why and how? How do we share the gospel within that context and to that group of people? And so that's kind of where I got this research paper topic from. I wanted to know why, and I wanted to know how. And I wanted to feel more prepared than I did to go into that context and to say, hey, this is the gospel. Within a context that is a post-Christian one, a postmodern one. I have felt very comfortable in the past going into cultures that were lost, say, because the majority religion was different, or a different area of the country even seemed easier to me. But going out of my own front door, going out to my neighbor, quite literally, and sharing the gospel has felt like a challenge to me. And that is why I chose this topic. So to dive in, I first started with defining what postmodernism and post-Christianity are. And so obviously both of these terms are massive terms, and there are whole books written on each topic. So I really think I skimmed the surface of what both of these meanings are. And after I defined it, I took some time to go in and then explain culturally how this affects, cultural effects of this, how those cultural effects have effect on missions and evangelism, and how we as the church can be prepared to respond as this becomes more of a norm for us. So to dive right in, postmodernism essentially is the belief that there is no universal truth. And to very simply put it, that is what a postmodern thought process is driven by. That's the root of it. There is no universal truth. This is not saying that truth that is found in church is wrong. It's saying that all truth, all universal truth is wrong. It's saying that whatever I want to be true is true. I think there are a lot of different effects that have have had an effect on this culture being ushered in. I looked at it kind of from a historical point of view just to kind of get a better understanding. But a postmodern age kind of followed the end, obviously followed a modern era of thinking. And that was really kind of tail end with the Enlightenment era, where a lot of early modern thinkers were beginning to process knowledge and power in a different way than they had historically done in the past. So the Enlightenment era established truly the following: so separation of church and state, science becoming the primary source of knowledge, human rights being defended, and the church was not the end-all be-all of knowledge anymore. It was a source of knowledge that you could follow, but it wasn't the end-all be-all of it. And so that really was a shift in history and in ways of thinking. And from that, I think we can see how a postmodern era was able to kind of come to the scene. I do not think that postmodernism is primarily coming from the Enlightenment era, but I do think that had a big effect on it. Like I said before, postmodernism is denying universal truth. I have a statement pulled up when I really started defining the paper. I wrote, to start, one claim of postmodernism is that our age does not have any dominating regime of knowledge and belief. This line of thinking is not only excluding knowledge and belief that are found in the church, but also the authority and power that scientific thinking established throughout the modern era. Then I said, with postmodern thinking, there is no truth. Truth is whatever you say it is. And then it followed by just kind of diving into this idea a little bit further of how that is the big root of what postmodernism is. A few other effects that I think, a few other things that have happened throughout our history and culture that have had effect on postmodernism, are the secularization of culture. I think that's a big one. So secularization of culture kind of goes hand in hand with that Enlightenment era theme of it's not just about the church anymore, and the church is not the end-all be-all and the power of knowledge, and it really began to install areas of rationalization and rationalizing in a way that is one's own and not just dictated by one person or another or the church or the schools or whatever. It really became a rationalization for oneself. Pluralization is another sector of secularization. So the articles that I was reading, you had secularization as like the umbrella, and then under it there were several, but there was two specific that really began to dive deep into postmodernism, and that was rationalization and pluralization. Rationalization I just went over, and pluralization is the idea of God being the sole authority being challenged and no longer seen as the one, the way, the truth, and the life, essentially. So that kind of sums up postmodernism in a very surface level view. I definitely think that even since I've turned this in, there's been so many other things I've read or seen or studied that I was like, oh my gosh, I could have added this to the paper. And I think that just shows that this topic is prevalent. I mean, I was in New York City a few weeks ago, and so many things. I would just walk around and I would see pamphlets about like, what is your truth? And I can't help but think like, this is all around us. Like, when did we get to this point where there is no universal truth? And how do we navigate without one? And so, as Christians, we see Jesus and we see God as the way, the truth, and the life. But in a culture and a society that not only doesn't see that, but also doesn't see the need or the necessity for universal truth, how do we navigate that? And so that is something is what I dove into a little bit further. The next section in the paper, I spent some time defining what a post-Christian society is. and kind of just discuss back and forth whether we are a post-Christian society. Is the U.S. a post-Christian society? And so just to get right into it, a post-Christian society is a society where more than half of the society are not believers, are not followers of Jesus. And some people would say that a post-Christian society follows a post-modern one. I do not agree with that. I don't think that, just as I wouldn't say the Enlightenment era is the cause of the postmodern era, and then the postmodern era is the cause of the post-Christian. I don't necessarily think that. I do think the two go hand in hand, and I do think that's where we're finding ourselves more than not. So I did look up some stats on post-Christian society and the rate at which people are becoming more and more and more unchurched and further away from the Lord. There was a few statistics that I found that were pretty eye-opening to me, at least, living in Mississippi. And, 10 years ago when I was graduating high school, I really felt like so many people around me were Christians and they really were following the Lord. And then 10 years later, I'm looking up finally and I'm seeing that's just not the case. And so the article that I read stated that only 43% of the United States is churched. So only 43% of U.S. adults are claiming to follow Christ. In that 43% is also included people that are claiming to go to church on like Easter and Christmas. And so if we were to break it down even further, we would see that number shrink even more. And then to take it a little bit further, 43% currently of adults in the United States claim to be Christian. However, if we're going to compare that to where it was before, that was 51% in 2009. So in 13 years, we've seen that almost decrease by 10%. That's a lot of people that have walked away from the church and said, no, I'm not, I'm good, I'm done. And so that really kind of shows the trajectory of where we are headed. And I think you can look at some areas of the U.S. and say that is a post-Christian society. Like, there are definitely more non-Christians than people that are Christians. And then you look at areas like I'm in Mississippi, and it's not as clear. We do have a lot of people that are professing to be Christians, but also in Mississippi we have a lot of people that are professing to be Christians, but are not following the Lord, and are in turn getting further and further away from Christ. I can think of so many people just off the top of my head, that close friends of mine that fall into that category of when we were, in high school and we were all going to church together. They were strong Christians. And then 5-6 years later, we're out of college and further away from Christ as they could be. Another thing within this article is that number, that 43%, is higher amongst millennials. And that is growing at an even drastic pace. And so I think those are the things that we should be kind of looking at as leaders in the church, to say, like, how are we going to shepherd and lead our churches in evangelism throughout this change in culture. And so those were some highlights from my section on the definition of Post-Chrisianity and what post-Christian means. One thing I wanted to specifically touch on here is that a post-Christian society is not a society where, people, that 43% is not people that aren't Christian because they grew up in a Buddhist context or a Muslim context. That's the people that have grown up in and around the church and have decided to part with it and to say, no, I do not want to follow this anymore. And I think that's something that as a church we should be very, very, very reflective on, and to say, hey, what's going on? what is it, and how can we fix that? Like, why are so many people deciding to leave the church? Like, the church is not innocent in that. I think there are many cases where the church has caused trauma and hurt to individuals, and they're like, no, I'm not doing it anymore, and I'm not raising my families in it. I think of one current friend of mine in particular, who was taught starting at a young age that the church was teaching waiting to have sex till you're married, and obviously that is biblical and that is something that needs to be taught. But the way her church taught it was essentially telling her, once you've had sex, you're used and done, and there's no redemption there. They told her instances like, once you've had sex, you're like a toothpaste bottle that's been emptied and you can never be filled back up. And that scarred her, because that told her that she was worthless. That told her that she was unredeemable. That told her that no one was going to want to have anything to do with her. And that's just not true. That's very contrary to the gospel. Is scripture clear about that topic, that we should wait for marriage, and that is a beautiful thing for husbands and wives? Absolutely. But the church also needs to preach in that if that does happen to you, and you do fall into temptation with your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and you have sex before you're married, Jesus still loves you, and you are still going to be redeemed. You are not an empty toothpaste bottle. That blood of Christ redeems you in that. And that is not, I know that firsthand, like, that is not something that is taught in the church where I'm from. We don't hear the redemption of Jesus in that. And that particular friend today refuses to go to church. We've had multiple conversations about how she's all about Jesus, and she, like, if it was just based off the life and death of Jesus, she can get behind that. But because of the church and what the church has done to her, she does not want to be a Christian. And so I think that's something, as we're entering this, and as we see more people become unchurched, and as we see more people claiming to be in a post-Christian society, we need to take a reflective look and say, where have I wronged people? And where have I hurt people? And how can I redeem that? How can I right that wrong? Moving on, I could get on that soapbox for a while, and rightfully so. I mean, I think that's a topic that needs to be talked about. So we spent some time defining postmodernism, post-Chrisianity, what the two of those are. And then the next portion of my paper really covered the cultural effects of these two, and what does that look like, and how has that and how is that shaping the culture that we're in. One of the articles that I read basically was referring to postmodernism as the guiding force of today's popular culture. You see postmodernism in everything. You see it in television, in media, social media, educators, politics. Wherever you're looking, you can see the effects of postmodernism. Like I said, even like where I'm at, I can look around and see it. What is my truth? I mean, I hear people say that all the time. Like, what is my truth? And well, I mean, truth is objective. Like, there is an objective truth. And so that is one thing that I think is good to note on and to kind of dive into a little bit, is just really beginning to open my eyes to see, like, there are specific effects on culture, but more than not, especially in a public setting, you can see it in a lot of areas. There was one quote that said, you see it throughout art, architecture, history, literature, you name it, it's there. I took some time to define, not to just give like a broad view of different areas in which culture was affected, and then I really wanted to dive into a few specific examples of postmodernism and the idea of, like, what is my truth, no universal truth, and that effect. I really could have probably written a whole paper just on the effects of culture from postmodernism, and maybe I should have. But one area that I really think is very prevalent today in our culture across the U.S. is the idea of identity. So you have these big pictures, right? Media, architecture, art, education, politics, where this idea of what is your truth is being portrayed. And then let's take that in. We're hearing that every day. We're seeing that every day. And I think we're beginning to see the big effect that that is having on identity, and how the traditional ways of thinking, the traditional Christian ways of thinking, is being challenged. Some of the articles I read, or one of them specifically, really took a lot of time to look at how postmodern thinkers, that there's no essential human nature, and that their own identity biologically, socially, psychologically can be and should be defined by the individual. And I think the thing here culturally that we're seeing is tearing down God's creation, and it's saying like God didn't create us with a specific unique identity as his child. That didn't happen. You go out and you define your own identity. And so I said, this is not just changing external circumstances of culture, but it is attacking the identities that God gave humans at creation. And I think that's important for us to kind of think about and dive into and just like sit in for a second. Like, how have I even done that? You know, one way in particular would be my career. My career defines me. It is my truth. It is my identity. And then take a step further into the spiritual implications of that. What does that create? Does that create joy? Does that create spiritual health or growth? No, it creates anxiety and burnout when we are attributing and making our identity things other than what God has given us as our identity. So that was one big thing with culture, is just the identity, kind of the identity issue. I think we see that the biggest topic within identity would be that of the LGBTQ plus community, and how we're beginning to see that become the norm in the United States. And it's such a complex issue, I believe, because I think about my friends that are gay or trans, and to them their identity is in their sexuality, and they have the ability to say, this is who I am, this is my truth, and that is attacking the identity that the Lord has given them. And so I think that, I mean, I could talk probably for 23 more minutes about that. But that was one of the big implications that I saw and have seen firsthand, even in Mississippi, even in Starkville. This past weekend we had a pride parade, and just to see like the turnout for that, and to see how accepted it is, even in a super, super southern Bible Belt state, really is beginning to open my eyes even further that the United States is not the Christian nation that it once was believed to be. So how are these things affecting the church and missions, and how can we be prepared to navigate through them? As we've talked about, postmodernism is infiltrating almost every area of popular culture. It is also even translating into our own identity and how people view and see themselves. So how do we navigate that as a church? And what can we do as we're navigating that, to kind of right some of these wrongs that people have been hurt by. So one of the biggest things throughout the paper and throughout my presentation so far is just the threat of universal truth. And I think arguably the biggest challenge postmodernism and a post-Christian society pose to missions in the church is that it's attacking that idea that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There is no question if there is a universal truth. We know that. We know what the universal truth is, and we follow that. But how do we share that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life when people don't believe in truth and they don't believe in that there is any? They can take it and they can run with it and do with it as they will, and because there is no universal truth, that they can mold it and make it into what they want it to be. So I think one of the big things that I wrote about, on top of that, just the idea of like universal truth and us knowing that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I think another big part of that is within the church. What challenges will that pose? I think the evangelistic challenges are pretty obvious. I think that learning how to share the gospel with someone that has never heard, learning how to share the gospel with somebody that doesn't believe in truth, that is the challenge, in itself. It's finding ways to be able to see and to dive into that. And that's something we'll talk about in the next section. One thing I really was kind of convicted by when writing this and wrote about within the paper was the challenges that we need to be prepared for within the church. And that being the misuse and misinterpretation of Scripture. I think we see that often. I think that is very clear throughout just the church in a lot of ways. I mean, a lot of times in Bible study, people ask questions like, what does this mean to you? And I think that it can be a dangerous way of thinking, and that is kind of a postmodern effect within the church, and a challenge that the church has to be aware of. So the final section of this paper, I spent some time just talking through what the church's response should be to the fact that we are, in some places not, in a post-Christian, postmodern society. And I think the big thing that I read over and over again was just learning that the church is not in the same society that it used to be. I think you'll have many people like myself who have been in the church, are uncomfortable in the church, and haven't really left the church long enough to realize that the culture around them that is unchurched is way different than it used to be. One quote from an article entitled "Missions in a Postmodern Society" said, "The Christian West belongs to the past. The era of Christendom has ended. There's no room for triumphalism and joy of power of that past. Indeed, there is a need for a servant church." And so going on to that idea of like, I feel like at some point the church really was dominant, and we've talked about that and we know that. But it's time for the church to realize like the church is not the majority anymore, and to really kind of have a shift really into what it really means to be a servant church. We've got to learn and how to rediscover how to be a church in a society that's not Christian. In a society that's not Christian due to the fact that people have denied Christianity. One thing I see a lot in Mississippi is I'll go to the grocery store and you'll have the little old men passing out gospel tracts, and while I think it's the sweetest thing, and I think it's so awesome to see people going out there to serve the Lord in that way, I can't help but think that gospel tracts are not the way to successfully share in the context that we're in today, because people know the gospel. I mean, they know the gospel. They don't believe the gospel. They're missing key truths of the gospel. So I think it's important for us to learn what those truths are, and to incorporate those into how we share the gospel. My church is actually going through a potential merger, and I'm on the merger exploration team, and I'm helping with like the naming, identity, and branding. And one question they asked as they were interviewing us and trying to get a feel for our culture around us is, what is your city missing about Jesus? And I was like, wow, what a great question. And I think that's something that we have to ask ourselves when we're preparing to walk into any gospel conversation. What is our culture missing about Jesus? What is this person I'm about to talk to? What are they missing about Jesus, specifically in a post-Christian one? Because that implies like they know about Jesus, but obviously they're missing something about Jesus to want to follow him and want to be his disciple. And so I think step one in this is to learn and to identify as a church that we are not a Christian society anymore. And how do we navigate this? I think I loved how that same article referred to identifying bridge people, or better way to say it, mediators within the church that can go out and say like, hey, let's walk hand in hand with this culture and learn how to navigate this. It's a daunting task. It's a daunting task to learn how to share in any kind of culture, but specifically one that you're implanted in and that's been changing around you. As we know, this is referred to as contextualization. And I took some time just to review what contextualization is in my paper. Referred to the chapter in Encountering Theology of Mission. That just did a really great job of putting into perspective what contextualization is. And I loved this quote. It really just kind of helped me to help understand a little bit further. But it says, contextualization means relating the never-changing truths of Scripture to ever-changing human context, so that those truths are clear and compelling. It is the process of engaging culture in all its varied dimensions with biblical truth. Appropriate contextualization shapes the presentation of the gospel and the release of its transforming power in evangelism, lifestyle, church life, and social change. So I think taking contextualization with that idea of a bridge person and identifying those people within our churches, within our small groups, within our Christian friend groups, to say like, you have a knack for like going into a culture and helping to communicate and to relate, and then having them, whether it's yourself or somebody in your church that can do that, to go out and to learn what is it that this context needs about Jesus, and how is this culture far off from the truth of Jesus, and what can we do to communicate that better? We are not changing the gospel to contextualize. We are identifying and we are communicating what it is they need to hear about Jesus. I think in my area, there are a few things. Jesus in this area is traditional, and he is not relatable. Jesus is unattainable, and Jesus is disappointed in us. These are all things that people my age growing up in Mississippi have heard, and the effect that has had on them, and no surprise they don't want to follow the Lord. So learning how to communicate that to this group of people, I think, is going to be a key aspect to learning how to contextualize in this environment. I think the third thing, so we had first identifying that we are not in the culture that we thought we were. 2, identifying those people within our bodies that can go out and help the church to contextualize and to share a gospel that is still keeping to biblical truth, but also helping them to relate and to understand what that is. And I think a big part and a big key factor is truly learning how to do all of that while also doing it in a way that is developing friendships. Simply put, we know this is not new. This is not a new idea or concept. But I think it's something that is becoming more relevant in a postmodern and a post-Christian one. We have people around us that know the gospel, but they don't believe it. And they don't believe it because they don't trust the church. And so I think a big part of that is bringing people into us and saying, and giving them a reason to trust us, and giving them a reason to say, I want to follow this. And that can't be done just by giving out gospel tracts. And that can't be done, well, I shouldn't say it can't be done. It can be done. God can do whatever he wants. And he will use whoever he wants. But from what I'm seeing, I just see this bigger emphasis on really developing those friendships with people. And ooh, my chair just cracked. And helping them to see and trust Jesus in a lot of ways as well. Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote this. I said, when we share the gospel from a place of friendship, care, and personal experience, people are more likely to give the gospel the time of the day it deserves, especially in this context. People just don't trust the church. They don't want to follow it. And so I think it's important that we give people a reason to do so. So that concludes my paper. Just to recap, we've discussed what postmodernism is. We've discussed what a post-Christian society is. We've discussed what the cultural implications of both of those societies have on the church, the threats that poses to missions, and how we as a church can begin to navigate that. I definitely think that this paper has really given me a clear insight of what and how to begin to navigate within a postmodern and a post-Christian society. There are some things that I was affirmed with, and there are some things that I was challenged by. But ultimately, I think that the Lord really began to just solidify that, one, we should all be doing this. It doesn't matter if we're in Mississippi or North Carolina or Tennessee or Georgia or wherever you're at. It's time for us to all look around us and say, what is the culture around us looking like? Is it a post-Christian one? Is it a postmodern one? And how can we begin to prepare our own hearts, not to mention our church's hearts, to go into this context and share the gospel? We cannot forget the culture around us when we are going to fulfill God's mission. Like I said earlier, in my own heart, I was going to the nations, and that is biblical, but I was forgetting my neighbors. And that is what I want to leave you guys with, is do not forget your neighbors in this pursuit. Do not forget to reach out to them and to relate to them and to share the gospel with them too. Thank you so much.